I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Online. Today we're going to look at a type of design, a design style that is used in competition but also might be something that you would enjoy doing just because it looks nice, it looks natural. And that's the basis of it. Naturalistic design in terms of definition means that the placement of your plant material should be in as natural a growing style or shape as possible. And the confusion sometimes comes in competition when we look at the difference between naturalistic and landscape. Now, landscape is a design where every part of the landscape is shown within the design. So you have to have soil and mushrooms or fungus or reeds, flowers, shrubs, trees. Now, not necessarily so that you can obviously identify that it's a tree, but something like this, something that would be a piece of bark that shows the bark, shows that it's a tree, and you would use that perhaps as your base, and then you would have some mulch or a little bit of dirt around the edge of it to indicate the dirt as part of the landscape. What you have to be careful of in a landscape design is that you only use sympathetic plant material, so plant material that would naturally be found in the same landscape. If we go back to the naturalistic design, which we're going to look at today, I can still use this because it's natural. It's obviously been cut and it's beginning to dry out, so we're getting that crack in it. But as the basis for a design, I can use it. What I need to do is ensure that when I place the plant material around this, that it is shown in its natural growing style or shape, so that it looks like it has naturally grown there. So when I do the placements, you'll see what I mean, and I'll talk about how I'm going to place them. And it's also, this type of design is also good when you've got plant material that isn't perfect. Now, we all know, we go out into the gardens and we see things and we think, oh, it's a shame it hasn't got the straight stem and it won't be any good for looking in a vase or a display of any kind. I went out earlier this week and I picked some pineapple lilies, and they have a tendency, I'm just looking down at the bucket, they have a tendency to grow in their own direction. So I've got ones that are completely bent over. I've got ones that are twisted. And normally I don't have a problem using them in designs, but they're not perfect. They're not the straight up and down that you would normally see, and certainly there were those on the plant as well. But I thought for this design, just to show you how you can use plant material that's not perfect and make it into something that looks wonderful. The other thing that's prevalent at the moment around the place is Agapanthus, and once the flowers are gone, what are you going to do with it? Well, I'll show you how you can use this in a naturalistic design, because this is the natural way that this plant loses its flowers, and the next thing you see is the seed pods, and then they will dry out and blacken, and then you can pull them off and you can just use the ball shape of the spikes themselves, or you can let it dry out completely and spray paint it. Once you've taken the seed heads off, it's not a part of the naturalistic design anymore, because that doesn't happen normally. What normally happens in a naturalistic term is that these seed pods open out and the seeds are expelled. So you could use it, you could let it dry that way and still use it in a naturalistic design dried. So if we move on to the dried material, the best example of dried material that is the most easy to use and to make is Strelitzia leaves. Now, these are all off the same plant, and they are the best thing to use if you're looking at getting something that's got a bit of rhythm and movement in it without having to do anything at all. Now, all of these, as I said, came off the same plant, and all I did was cut them and leave them alone, and that's all you do. You just put them somewhere where they're not necessarily in direct sunlight, because they might dry out too quickly, but somewhere where they're not going to be constrained by their drying pattern, and they will all dry differently, so you'll never get two the same, but you certainly get some interesting shapes. So let's now move on to actually putting together the naturalistic design, and for that we're going to focus on the table, so you'll just see the talking hands rather than my head. Now to our naturalistic design. So first of all, I've got this slice of, it's actually a Banksia, and it came down in a storm, and my dad very kindly sliced it up for me so that I could use the slices. What is happening with it is obviously that it's drying out and it's cracking, and I actually don't mind that because in lots of ways I can use that as part of the mechanics for designs. So I'm quite happy and I feel that it looks a bit more natural when it naturally dries that way. So I am going to use it this way. Obviously you could use it all sorts of ways, have it down flat, you could cover up that crack and have your container there. We could use the dried material that we had before, and you could actually just push that into the crack and it will stay. And give you a nice interesting design like that. I won't push it in too far because I don't want to use it today. Something like that, and you can twist them around, and you know, as an interesting piece on its own. I'll just move out of the shot so you can see it behind it. So an interesting presentation of some material just as a feature piece somewhere. Lots of movement. It repeats the circular base, so in terms of a naturalistic design, you could get away with that because that is the way that these Strelitzia leaves will dry, and that's probably the way that they would grow if they had a fallen tree up against them. That's how they would appear. So if you think about, if you looked at the plant and you looked at the way it's growing, that's what you want to replicate in your design. We'll put them aside. And for today, I'm actually going to stand it up on its side because it's the best way for me to hide the container that I'm going to use. And it also gives me an opportunity, as you will see, to drape the plant material down in front of it to lessen the impact of that very solid bit of timber. But it also showcases the way this plant material has grown. So we're going to use the pineapple lilies. So let's first of all, we'll just move that out of the way so we can work on the placement of the pineapple lilies. Now this is just a drinking glass from the kitchen, and I have already put water in it. And what I've done, because we're trying not to use floral foam anymore because it's really not terribly good for the environment. I haven't tried any of the biodegradable ones as yet. I will get around to using those, but in the meantime I've gone back to the way that flower arranging used to be done, just to explore and see how well I can use the materials and the styles and the mechanics that were used prior to floral foam being introduced. So for this one, what I've got is just some wire that I've scrunched up into a shape of any kind, and then just pushed it into the container so that it's hard up against the edges of the container. Now I started using this as a system about 2 months ago, and I'm really fond of it. I really find that it works well for me to do the placements. The mess of wire, as you might call it, means that there are lots of places where stems are held in place, so that you can get some really good solid placements in places that you want. So let's first of all look at the plant material we've got. We've got a couple of ones that are very much draping style. So we just to get the height right. So I want them to come sort of over the sides. The way that a pineapple, for those of you who don't know, a pineapple lily, it is a plant that for the most of the year looks like nothing's going to happen. And actually in winter it dies off completely, and so you wouldn't know it was there. And then in spring the leaves come out, very much like tulips I suppose in that sense. And then these flower spikes come out, and they come out all over the plant. And they grow, as you'll see, in all sorts of different directions. So I'm just going to cut the stems down a little bit. So so that I can do the placements. And that's just pushing it in through the wire until I get it to a point where I'm happy that it's going to sit. Now that one's not quite touching the bench. Remember, for competition work you can't have anything touching the bench because it would appear to the judges that the bench is actually supporting that plant material. So that's why we have the space. But it's also good to have a bit of space underneath because it gives you that negative space, gives you a little bit of room around the design for the judges to look at and to see the design in its completeness. Let's see if we've got one on the other side. And this is a nice twisty one we might have. And what we want to do is not have it so that everything is at the front. We want to create some interest and some height in the design, so we might have this one a little bit higher up. So we don't need to trim it too much. And the beauty of using the wire system is that you can mix and match and move your placements around. And you're not making holes in the foam. And for this particular plant material, it doesn't like foam because the foam clogs up I'll show you the stem is quite soft, and so the foam breaks up and clogs those cells, and it can't take water up. So it's not any use for it being in foam, particularly you can't keep it in foam for very long. One of our taller ones. And this one I'm going to place right at the back, and I might even have it facing away from the design a little bit. I'm just pushing this other one so you can see. I'm just pushing, separating the wire a little bit so that I can get in because it's quite a thick stem. Still needs to be trimmed a bit more. And the reason we're bringing this one back is to give the design some depth. So we've got a very heavy front to it. We want to be able to feel that there is a complete design, not just a almost two-dimensional design. And now we're going to bring some material that drapes over the front in a similar fashion. Now with your placements, you also need to be fairly careful that you're not doing what we call smarty placements, so it's dot, 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 dot everywhere. So decide on the placements and how they're going to work. You'll see that I have started to push them all to one side. That first one's definitely not happy about leaning over. So what we might do is we can twist it because, once again, naturalistically, that might happen when it was growing. It might get blown by the wind and pushed over in front of or across some of the other designs. And you can see that it's much happier in that way. Now that's plenty of placement in terms of the stems of the feature plant material that we're going to use. That's 5. We do need to soften it a little bit, change the texture. What we've got is rough texture here, a little bit smoother there. But it's a flat texture. We've got some busy texture here, and it gives the impression of being rough. So we want something smooth to soften that and to rest our eyes on it. So I've actually got some, and this is very similar to the foliage that is on the pineapple lily, but I didn't pick any of that. I picked the Agapanthus foliage because it's actually longer, but it's the same style and it grows in the same way. So if you look at an Agapanthus, the foliage all comes out pretty much the same, radiates out from a single point, and so that's what we want to do in terms of our naturalistic design. And what we want to do is have it so that it fills that gap that's there, but not completely, so that we've still got space around all of the other parts of the design. So I'll put them all in together, and that way it's going to mirror that placement the way I want it to go. Now I've got another couple of leaves, so I could bring one out this way. Still appears to be radiating from the same point of emergence, as we say, but it's bringing it a little bit more over onto this side of the design. And as you can see, there's a couple of live insects just to make it all real. Now what we could do with that is we could actually add another feature plant, but I'm quite happy with that as the design the way it is. Naturalistic means it looks like you've just pulled the plant out of the ground and dumped it into some display mechanism. So I'm happy with that as a naturalistic design. I'm just keeping an eye on the ants that are there. So naturalistic design placements in your vase or your container the way that the plant would grow naturally. And that's different to landscape because we're looking at one or two plant materials rather than a view or representation across the whole of one landscape. So there we go, that's our first design for naturalistic. I will do another quick one that shows you how you can use the semi-dried material. We talked about the Agapanthus heads. So what I'm going to do is take out the pineapple lilies and we'll look at how we can use those two Agapanthus heads and have a different design but still naturalistic in that sense. So what we've got is our container. Same container as I used in the last design. I've spread out the Agapanthus foliage a little bit more so that because we're going to use the heads and they're quite bulky here in this centre. So what happens with Agapanthus is that you have this great base of foliage and then the flower spikes come out and they're really tall. Sometimes you get little ones. And so today we're going to have the little ones. And these are obviously flower heads that are finished flowering. This one's starting to dry out as well. And what we need to do is just remove the dead parts of the flowers. We want to leave the seed heads there and any of the dried material that you'll see in a minute how it's drying out. So all I'm doing is they're very papery, just pulling off the spent flower petals so that we're left with the seed pods themselves on the end of the flower spot. So we still get that shape of the Agapanthus. It's still, for most people, it would still be recognisable as an Agapanthus, but we've just taken the flowers off. And this is a great way to use them because they're so long lasting, and you can, of course, let it dry out completely and use it dried. Although what I find here, because we have so much humidity, is they go a bit spotty. So I tend to dry them out and then I'll spray paint them because you can still use them in moderation in your designs, and they do give you a nice big fill for your design. So there we go, we've taken off all the flower heads. Now I've particularly chosen this one because it's from the purple flower, so the seed head has that darker mark through it, which just makes it a little bit more interesting. And what would normally happen is that these would obviously grow much higher, but as I said, we're going to have them in their natural environment, so we would have one or two that would come out of the plant itself, and it's just a matter of pushing it down. Now these So there we have another version of the naturalistic design. What I've done with this, I put the 2 Agapanthus heads in, as you saw, and then I felt that the bark, the Banksia, still needed something to soften that a little bit, so I picked one of the smaller of the pineapple lilies and just draped it in its natural growing pattern over the front of the Banksia, just to break up that space a little bit and to bring your eyes down and around. I could add a little bit more of the foliage for the Agapanthus, and that probably would finish it off a little bit more at the back, but I quite like more minimalist designs, so I would, for me personally, I would leave it this way. So there we have 2 versions of the naturalistic style of designing, one with pineapple lilies and one with Agapanthus seed heads and a little bit of pineapple lily. As always, if you've got questions, please leave that in the comments section below, and I'm more than happy to answer those for you. But for now, naturalistic design.